My name is Grace Holloway. I am 49 years old. I work as a compliance officer for a regional hospital network in Savannah, Georgia. And on the afternoon of my grandmother's memorial luncheon, my own sister stood up in a room full of relatives and accused me of forging our grandmother's will. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull me aside. She stood at the head of my grandmother's dining table in the house where I had learned to walk and said, loud enough for every cousin and aunt and family friend to hear, Grace changed Grandma's will while she was too sick to know what she was signing. I remember the exact sound the room made. Not gasps, just silence, thick and sudden, like someone had turned down the volume on the whole world. 40 people stopped chewing. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere near the window, and nobody moved to pick it back up. I didn't answer her right away. I set my sweet tea down on the table, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at my sister Renee the way I imagine I look at hospital administrators who try to slide something questionable past me at work. Calm, patient, already 3 steps ahead. Because what none of them knew, what I had never told a single person in my family, was that I had spent the last 2 years documenting every financial decision my sister and her husband had made with our grandmother's money. And I was about to find out that the will wasn't even the real story. The real story was much worse than that. If you're enjoying stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. To understand how I ended up standing in that dining room being called a liar by my own blood, you have to go back almost 30 years to a small house on Ashwood Lane in a modest neighborhood outside Savannah, where I was the older of 2 daughters born to a schoolteacher and a shipyard electrician. My father, Thomas Holloway, was a good man in most of the ways that mattered. He worked long hours, he never missed a church service, and he loved his daughters fiercely in his own quiet way. But he had one weakness he never outgrew. He could not say no to Renee. Not when she cried, not when she pouted, not when she was 31 years old and asking him to co-sign a loan he couldn't afford. My mother passed away when I was 19, from a sudden heart condition nobody had seen coming, and after that, my father leaned even harder into whatever kept the peace at home. And keeping the peace, in our house, almost always meant giving Renee whatever she wanted. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because it's simply what happened, and understanding it matters for everything that came later. I was the responsible one. That was my role in the family, assigned to me so early that I don't remember a version of myself before it. I got good grades because good grades meant one less thing for my father to worry about. I got a scholarship to college because scholarships meant one less bill. I remember being 11 years old, doing the grocery shopping with a list my mother had written on the back of an envelope, carefully checking prices against the little bit of cash I'd been given, because even then, someone in that house needed to be careful with money, and it clearly wasn't going to be Renee. Renee was 4 years younger than me, and from the moment she was born, she had a kind of gravity to her that I never quite understood. She didn't try to be the center of attention. She simply was, the way certain people just are, and my father orbited her without ever seeming to notice he was doing it. I remember one particular Christmas when I was 14 and Renee was 10. I had saved up babysitting money for months to buy my mother a nice scarf. Renee, without any savings at all, asked our father for money to get Mom something special, and came home with a bottle of perfume that cost 3 times what I had spent. When my mother opened both gifts, she thanked me warmly for the scarf, and then spent 5 minutes gushing over how thoughtful Renee was to think of something so nice. Nobody in that room seemed to notice that Renee hadn't paid for a single bit of it herself. I noticed. I noticed everything. That was, I think, where my career actually began, long before I ever set foot in a classroom for it. The habit of noticing what other people missed and quietly filing it away. I became a nurse first, working the medical floor at a hospital downtown for almost 11 years, and later moved into hospital compliance and risk management because I liked systems that made sense, rules that existed for a reason, records that couldn't be argued with. A world where 2 + 2 always equaled 4 no matter how badly someone wanted it to equal 5. I built a career auditing documentation, tracking down discrepancies in patient records, catching the small inconsistencies that, left alone, could turn into much larger problems. I was good at it. I liked being good at something that quietly protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Renee became a real estate agent, then a part-time real estate agent, then, depending on the year, an aspiring interior designer, a wellness coach, or whatever new venture required an initial investment from someone else. Usually our father. Later, our grandmother. She married Craig Sutton when she was 26, a charming man who sold insurance and always seemed to be one deal away from a breakthrough that never quite arrived. Our grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, was the anchor of our family. She had raised 4 children on a widow's pension after my grandfather died young, and she had a mind for money sharper than anyone gave her credit for, right up until her final years, when her memory began to slip. She kept a garden of tomatoes and okra behind her house well into her 80s, and every Sunday for as long as I can remember, our whole extended family gathered at her table for supper. She was the kind of woman who remembered every grandchild's birthday, every allergy, every small heartbreak you'd mentioned to her once, years earlier, in passing. When my grandmother's health started declining around 6 years ago, my father asked me to help manage some of her affairs, since my career had given me an understanding of paperwork, insurance, and financial documentation that neither he nor Renee possessed. I said yes, of course. She was my grandmother. I would have said yes even without the qualifications. What I didn't know then was that saying yes to that responsibility would put me directly in the path of a plan that had already been quietly forming for years. I started noticing small things first. A withdrawal from my grandmother's account for $4,000 made the same week Renee announced she was launching a new staging business for home sales. A transfer of $8,000, listed only as family loan, with no paperwork attached, no repayment schedule, nothing formal at all. When I asked my grandmother about it during one of her clearer weeks, sitting with her on the porch while she shelled peas into a metal bowl, she smiled and patted my hand and said, "Renee needed a little help, honey. You know how she gets." I let it go. That was one of my first mistakes, though I didn't see it that way at the time. I told myself it was a small amount, that my grandmother was a grown woman entitled to spend her own money however she wanted, that it wasn't my place to question every gift she chose to give her younger granddaughter. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was what I found 18 months later, buried in a folder of documents my grandmother asked me to organize for her taxes. It was a promissory note, handwritten, informal, barely legal, but a promissory note nonetheless, for $62,000, borrowed by Renee and Craig over the course of 4 years to fund a chain of vacation rental properties that, as far as I could tell from the paperwork attached to it, existed mostly on paper. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I want to be honest with you about why. Part of it was that I wasn't certain what I was looking at, and I didn't want to accuse my own sister of something based on an incomplete picture. But if I'm being fully truthful, part of it was fear. The old, familiar fear of being the one who disrupts the peace, the role I had spent my whole life avoiding, ever since that Christmas with the scarf and the perfume. So instead, I did what I do best. I started keeping records. I made copies of every document I found, quietly, over the course of several visits, always careful to put the originals back exactly where I'd found them. I kept a private folder, separate from my grandmother's official files, with dates, amounts, and notes attached to each one. I saved emails between Craig and a property management company that never seemed to manage any actual properties, forwarded to me by accident once when my grandmother asked me to help her check her email, and I saw a message still open on the screen. I photographed handwritten notes before returning them to their original place in her desk drawer. At the hospital, we call this an audit trail. In my family, I suppose you could call it self-defense. I told myself I was doing it in case my grandmother's health declined further, and someone needed a clear picture of her finances. That was true. But underneath that reasonable explanation was something else, something I wasn't ready to admit yet, even to myself. I didn't trust my sister, and for the first time in my life, I was preparing for the possibility that I would need proof of that distrust. 2 years passed this way. My grandmother's memory worsened steadily, the way these things do, slowly and then all at once. Renee's visits to her increased sharply, almost overnight, always alone, always in the afternoons when I was at work. My father, ever eager to believe the best about his younger daughter, seemed relieved that someone besides me was stepping up, as he put it once, not realizing how those words landed on me after everything I had quietly been carrying. I should have noticed the warning in that relief. I didn't, not fully, not until it was almost too late. The truth is, the warning signs had been there for years before I ever found that promissory note. And looking back now, I can trace them like a string pulled taut across time. When I was 26, fresh into my nursing career, Renee asked to borrow $3,000 from me directly, promising to pay it back within 6 months so she could cover a security deposit on her first apartment. I gave it to her without hesitation, the way you do for a younger sister you love. 4 years later, she still hadn't mentioned it once, and when I finally brought it up, gently, over coffee, she looked genuinely wounded, as though I had accused her of something monstrous. "I can't believe you'd bring up money at a time like this," she said, though I couldn't for the life of me figure out what time she meant, since nothing in particular was happening that day. That was Renee's gift, even back then, the ability to turn any accountability into an accusation against the person asking for it. I let the $3,000 go. It felt easier than fighting about it, and I told myself it didn't matter, that family wasn't about keeping score. I would tell myself that same thing in different forms for the next 20 years. There was another moment, maybe 8 years before my grandmother passed, when my father needed a new roof after a bad storm season, and I quietly covered half the cost myself without telling Renee, because I didn't want it to become a competition or a source of resentment. I only mentioned it once, years later, and Renee seemed surprised, almost hurt, that I hadn't asked her to split it. She never offered to pay any of it back. I didn't expect her to. By then, I think some part of me had already accepted that keeping the peace in my family meant absorbing costs quietly and never speaking of them again. There was one afternoon, about a year before my grandmother passed, when I stopped by unannounced and found Renee already there, papers spread across the kitchen table, a pen in my grandmother's hand. My grandmother looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not guilt, exactly, more like confusion, the look of someone caught in the middle of a sentence she couldn't remember starting. "What are y'all working on?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Just some paperwork for the house," Renee said, sliding the papers together a little too quickly. "Nothing important." I didn't push it that day. I wish I had. But I did go home and add that date to my folder with a short note. Renee plus Grandma, kitchen table, papers, signature, no explanation given. That single line, written almost as an afterthought, would end up mattering more than I could have guessed. The betrayal, when it finally came, didn't arrive the way I expected. I thought if something happened, it would happen quietly. A bank statement I couldn't explain, a signature that looked slightly wrong. Instead, it happened in the most public way imaginable, at the one event where every branch of our extended family would be gathered in the same room. My grandmother's memorial luncheon, 3 weeks after she passed away peacefully in her sleep at 89 years old. The lawyer had read the will the day before, privately in his office, exactly as my grandmother had requested. I was there. Renee was there. My father was there. The will was simple, almost old-fashioned in its fairness. The house and the majority of the estate were to be divided evenly between my father and his siblings, with a smaller trust set aside for Renee and me, split equally between us. Renee did not react well. She didn't say anything in the lawyer's office. She sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and thanked the lawyer politely on our way out. I remember thinking at the time that her calmness was a good sign. I understand now that it was something closer to the quiet of someone recalculating. The next day at the luncheon, in front of nearly 40 relatives eating chicken salad and deviled eggs off my grandmother's good china, she stood up and announced that I had manipulated our grandmother into changing the will, using my position of trust and my insider access to her paperwork to cut Renee out of what she was owed. She had Grandma sign new documents when she wasn't in her right mind, Renee said, her voice cracking with what looked, to everyone in that room, like genuine grief. I have proof. I have witnesses who saw Grace alone with Grandma's paperwork for hours at a time. Ask anyone. Ask Craig. Craig nodded solemnly beside her, playing his part. I want to be honest with you. For one single moment, standing there, I doubted myself. That's what a good manipulation does. Even the person who knows the truth feels a flicker of uncertainty, because the accusation is delivered with such conviction, in a voice trembling with such believable tears. But that moment passed quickly, because I had spent 2 years building something Renee didn't know existed. I do have a lot of Grandma's paperwork, I said calmly into the silence of that dining room. You're right about that. I organized her documents because someone needed to, and because she asked me to, going back nearly 6 years now. I'd be happy to show everyone exactly what's in those files. Craig stepped in at that point, his voice taking on the practiced tone of someone used to talking his way out of things at a sales table. This isn't the time or place, Grace. Nobody wants to relive this at a memorial. You're right, I said. It isn't the time or place I would have chosen either. But Renee brought it up in front of everyone. So I think everyone deserves the full picture, not just the part she wants you to hear. That was the moment the real story began to surface, and it wasn't the one Renee had planned to tell. I asked my father to sit down beside me, and I opened the folder I had brought with me that day. Not because I had planned an ambush, but because I had learned 2 years earlier never to attend a family gathering involving my grandmother's estate without it. The first document I showed the room was the promissory note, $62,000, signed by Renee and Craig, borrowed from my grandmother over 4 years for a vacation rental business. My Aunt Carol, my grandmother's youngest daughter, read it out loud without me asking her to, her voice growing quieter with each line, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. There's more, I said. I laid out the bank statements next, showing withdrawal after withdrawal, all made during a period when my grandmother's own doctor had documented significant memory decline in her medical file. Decline that Renee herself had referenced months earlier in a text message to Craig, which I had saved and printed and tucked at the very back of my folder. I hadn't wanted to use it. I want you to understand that. I had kept that message for nearly 2 years, hoping I would never need it, hoping some version of my sister would surface that didn't require it. Read it, my father said quietly when I hesitated. The text was short. She won't even remember signing this by next week. Just get her to do it before Grace comes by. I watched my father's face as those words settled over him. I had never seen him look quite like that before. Not angry, not yet, just profoundly, quietly devastated. The way a person looks when a floor they'd been standing on their entire life turns out to have been hollow the whole time. The room did not erupt into shouting. That's not how these things happen in real life, not in my experience. What happened instead was quieter and, in some ways, more devastating. I watched my aunts and uncles and cousins go through a private accounting of every interaction they'd had with Renee over the past several years. Every request for a small loan, every excuse for a missed payment, every story about a business that never seemed to produce a single dollar of profit. And I watched their expressions change as those old memories rearranged themselves into a new, uglier pattern. My cousin Danny, who had co-signed a car loan for Renee 2 years earlier and never been fully repaid, went pale and set down his plate. My Aunt Carol reached over and took my hand under the table without saying a word. My Uncle Ray, who had loudly defended Renee not 10 minutes earlier, calling my paperwork probably some kind of misunderstanding, now stared down at the tablecloth as though he could will himself out of the room entirely. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, watching a room full of people finally see what I had seen for 2 years. I didn't. Mostly, I felt tired and a little sick to my stomach, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten how much it weighed. There is no joy in being right about something you desperately wished you were wrong about. Someone, I think it was my cousin Patricia, though the memory blurs a little at the edges, asked quietly, "How long have you known Grace?" "Pieces of it, on and off, for 2 years," I said. "The full picture, only recently." "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she asked, not unkindly, just genuinely puzzled. "Because I loved my grandmother, and I didn't want the last years of her life to be consumed by a fight I wasn't even certain I could win," I said. "And because some part of me kept hoping I was wrong." My father sat very still through all of it, staring at the phone in front of him, his jaw tight, his eyes wet in a way I had rarely seen from him. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to me. "Renee," he said, "is this true?" She didn't answer with words. Her face crumpled, not with the practiced grief from earlier, but with something rawer and less controlled. She grabbed her purse, told Craig they were leaving, and walked out of our grandmother's house without looking at either of us. That wasn't the end of it, though. What I didn't realize, sitting there in the ringing quiet after the front door slammed shut, was that the financial fallout would take almost a full year to fully untangle, and that it would reveal a few more things nobody in the family expected. The lawyer, once informed of the documentation, opened a formal review of the estate, delayed the distribution of funds, and requested full financial records from Renee and Craig, as was his right as executor's counsel. Craig resisted at first, insisting the vacation rental business was legitimate, that the delays were simply how these things go. But under closer inspection, it turned out there were no actual properties at all. Not one. The money had gone toward personal debts, credit card balances stretching back years, and a down payment on a house that was solely in Craig and Renee's name, never disclosed to the rest of the family, purchased the same year Renee had told everyone their finances were tight. There was no lawsuit. My family decided, together, in a series of quiet phone calls over the following weeks, that dragging our grandmother's memory through a courtroom would only cause more damage, more publicity, more pain for people who were already grieving. I agreed with that decision, even though part of me understood it meant Renee would never face any consequence beyond the one that mattered most: the truth, spoken clearly, in front of everyone who loved her. My father, as executor, worked with the estate's lawyer to formally document the outstanding loans as advances against Renee's inheritance, which meant her share of the remaining estate was reduced by the exact amount she had already taken, dollar for dollar. It wasn't revenge, it was arithmetic, and somehow that made it land even harder than shouting ever could have. Renee and I have not spoken since that day at the luncheon, though I've heard through my father that she and Craig eventually sold their house and moved to another state, somewhere near Craig's brother, starting over in a place where nobody knew the story. I don't know if she has ever admitted to herself what she did. I've made my peace with the possibility that she never will. Some people, I've come to understand, would rather live inside a story where they were misunderstood than face the far harder truth of what they actually did. My father and I grew closer after that, in a way that surprised me. He apologized to me one evening, months later, sitting on his porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea sweating in the humid Savannah air, in a voice I had never heard him use before. He told me he was sorry for every year he had made me feel like the responsible one, as though responsibility were a punishment rather than a strength. He said he understood now that I had been protecting this family long before anyone realized it needed protecting, going all the way back to a Christmas scarf he barely remembered, and I never forgot. I think about my grandmother often, especially in the quiet parts of my job, when I'm reviewing a hospital record or verifying a signature on a consent form, doing exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous work that nobody notices until the day it matters more than anything else in the world. I think she would have been heartbroken by what Renee did, but I also believe in the deepest part of myself that she would have been proud of how I handled it, not with anger, but with patience and proof, and a folder I never once hoped to have to open. I never wanted to be the person who exposed my own sister in front of our entire family. I want to be honest about that too. There was no satisfaction in it, not the kind people sometimes expect from a story like this. What I felt, standing in that dining room with the truth finally out in the open, wasn't victory. It was relief. The particular, exhausted relief of putting down a weight I had been carrying quietly for 2 years. One folder, one photograph, one saved message at a time. If there's a lesson in what happened to my family, I think it's this. The people who quietly do the responsible thing, year after year, without asking for credit, are often underestimated by the very people who benefit most from their reliability. Renee spent our whole lives assuming I would always be the steady one, the one who cleaned up messes and asked for nothing in return. She was right about the first part. She was wrong about the second. I didn't need revenge. I only needed the truth to be visible, and I had spent 2 quiet years making sure that when the moment finally came, it would be.